My name is Alyssa. I am 34 years old, and on the afternoon of my 5th wedding anniversary, I walked into my own master bedroom and caught my husband in bed with my best friend. I did not scream. I did not throw things. I simply pulled out my phone, snapped a crystal clear photograph of their panicked faces, set my wedding band on the nightstand, and walked out. Before I tell you how my husband's arrogance ended with him wearing handcuffs at his own engagement party, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to hide your true success to protect a fragile ego. Let me take you back to the exact moment my marriage dissolved. It was a Tuesday. I had wrapped up my work early, eager to surprise Liam for our anniversary. Liam was a mid-level sales director at a logistics company, a man whose confidence heavily outweighed his actual competence. He loved to view himself as the grand provider, the king of our household. I let him believe exactly that. I played the role of the struggling freelance bookkeeper, dressing in modest clothes from discount stores and driving a sputtering 15-year-old Honda sedan. I did this because I learned early in our relationship that Liam's ego could not handle a woman who outshone him. When I pulled into the driveway of our suburban home, his luxury sedan was parked at an odd angle. Right behind it sat a sleek white convertible. I recognized that car instantly. It belonged to Naomi, my supposed best friend of 7 years. Naomi was a public relations director who lived her entire life for social media aesthetics and constant competition. If I bought a new purse, Naomi had to buy a more expensive one. If I planned a vacation, she booked a better resort. I always brushed off her competitive nature as harmless insecurity. I never imagined her need to outdo me would extend to stealing my husband. I unlocked the front door quietly, holding a box containing a vintage watch I had spent months tracking down for him. The house was quiet, but a strange tension hung in the air. As I walked past the living room, I noticed 2 empty wine glasses on the coffee table. My heart began to pound, a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I climbed the oak staircase, the thick carpet muffling my footsteps. As I neared the master bedroom, the door was slightly ajar. The sounds coming from inside were unmistakable. I pushed the door open. The afternoon sunlight was streaming through the sheer curtains, illuminating Liam and Naomi tangled in my premium sheets. For a fraction of a second time, completely stopped, I watched them registering the profound betrayal not just from the man I had vowed to spend my life with, but from the woman who had stood beside me as a bridesmaid. They did not notice me immediately. It gave me a moment of absolute clarity. In that split second, all the love, all the compromise, and all the effort I had poured into our relationship evaporated. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I turned on the flash. The sudden bright burst of light illuminated the room like a lightning strike. Liam jolted upward, his face draining of all color. Naomi shrieked and scrambled backward, pulling the duvet up to her chin, her eyes wide with sheer terror. Neither of them could form a coherent word. They just stared at me, frozen in their guilt. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or demand an explanation. The absolute silence in the room was deafening. I calmly walked over to Liam's side of the bed. I slid the diamond wedding band off my left hand and placed it precisely in the center of his wooden nightstand. The metallic clink echoed loudly in the quiet room. I turned on my heel and walked out, leaving the door wide open. Adrenaline flooded my veins as I moved down the hallway toward the guest room. I grabbed a duffel bag from the closet and began throwing my cheap, everyday clothes into it. Jeans, plain sweaters, standard sneakers. The very costume I had worn to make Liam feel like the ultimate provider. Behind me, I heard Liam scrambling out of bed. Heavy footsteps thumped frantically down the hallway. He appeared in the doorway of the guest room, frantically pulling on a pair of sweatpants. His face was a mask of panic and desperate calculation. "Alyssa, wait," he stammered, holding his hands up as if trying to calm a wild animal. It is not what it looks like. Please, you have to let me explain. I continued, folding a pair of jeans, not even bothering to look in his direction. You are misunderstanding this entirely, he pleaded, stepping further into the room. It was a mistake. It meant absolutely nothing. We had too much to drink and things just got out of hand. You are completely overreacting. The audacity of his gaslighting was almost impressive. Caught red-handed in our marital bed. His first instinct was to tell me I was overreacting. I zipped up my duffel bag with a sharp, decisive pull. Naomi was still cowering upstairs. Too much of a coward to face the woman whose life she had just tried to ruin. I slung the bag over my shoulder and finally looked Liam dead in the eye. I offered him a cold, empty smile, brushing past him without speaking a single syllable. You cannot just walk away like this, Liam shouted, following me down the stairs. I pay the mortgage on this house. I provide everything for you. You have nowhere else to go. You are acting crazy. I reached the front door, my hand resting on the brass handle. I did not turn back to look at the beautiful home I had decorated, nor did I look at the man desperately shouting his empty threats. The power of my silence was completely suffocating him. He wanted me to scream, to cry, to beg for answers so he could regain control of the narrative. I denied him that satisfaction. I walked out the front door and down the driveway. I tossed my duffel bag onto the passenger seat of my beat-up Honda sedan. The engine sputtered slightly before roaring to life, a stark contrast to the smooth purr of Liam's luxury vehicle. As I backed out of the driveway, I glanced at the house one last time. Liam was standing in the doorway, his chest heaving, convinced he had just watched his dependent wife ruin her own life. He thought I was driving away with absolutely nothing. He thought he held all the financial power. He thought he was the master of his domain. I drove down the suburban street with a cold, calculating smile forming on my lips. Liam had no idea that the house he was standing in was owned by a corporate trust. He had no idea who he had really married, and he had no idea of the absolute financial devastation that was about to rain down on him. I pulled into a cheap motel past the city limits. The neon sign buzzed against the sky. It was exactly the place Liam expected me to go. A dingy room for his broke wife. I paid in cash, grabbed my bag, and walked into room 12. The space smelled of bleach and old smoke. I set my bag on the scratched wooden dresser and sat at the edge of the mattress. My phone vibrated, the screen illuminated with a new message. It was Liam. He had not taken my silent departure well. His ego was a fragile creature requiring constant feeding. By leaving without a fight, I starved him of the dramatic confrontation he desperately needed to justify his betrayal. He needed to feel like the winner. He needed to crush whatever pride he assumed I had left. I unlocked the screen and opened the text thread. His message was a masterclass in sheer arrogance and cruelty. You left because you know you have nothing. I am tired of supporting a broke bookkeeper who brings absolutely nothing to the table. Naomi actually has ambition. She is building a real career. Do not expect a single dime from me. My lawyers will destroy you if you try to take my money. Have a nice life at the bottom. I stared at the glowing words for a long moment. Then a sound escaped my throat. A genuine laugh. The laughter bubbled up from deep within my chest and echoed off the thin walls. It was not a laugh of hysteria. It was the pure joy of profound irony. Liam actually believed his own narrative. He truly thought he was the wealthy king casting out his peasant wife. He honestly believed he held all the financial cards. I tossed the phone onto the bed and unzipped a hidden compartment in my duffel bag. I pulled out a sleek encrypted laptop. This machine cost more than Liam's prized luxury sedan. I opened the lid and bypassed 3 layers of biometric security. I logged into my secure server. The screen blinked to life and displayed a complex dashboard of global financial routing, corporate trust structures, and encrypted data vaults. I was not a broke freelance bookkeeper. That was simply the convenient cover story I created to protect my peace and my assets. The truth was far more complicated and far more lucrative. I was a senior forensic accountant and cybersecurity expert. I ran an elite data protection and financial tracking firm. My clients were Fortune 500 companies, international banks, and private equity firms who needed absolute discretion. When corporate executives embezzled funds, or when foreign hackers breached financial networks, these conglomerates called me. I traced digital footprints, exposed corporate fraud, and secured vulnerabilities that their own internal teams could not even comprehend. Because of the highly sensitive nature of my work, absolute anonymity was my greatest weapon. I operated my entire enterprise under a layered web of anonymous limited liability companies. No one outside of my elite client roster and my immediate legal team knew my real identity. This anonymity served a dual purpose. It protected my clients from corporate espionage, and it protected me from men exactly like Liam. My annual income was not the meager $30,000 I reported to my husband. Last year alone, my firm brought in over $800,000 in pure profit. I had blind trusts, offshore investment portfolios, and a massive safety net that could sustain me for a dozen lifetimes. Liam thought I spent my days balancing spreadsheets for local bakeries. He thought my exhausted sighs at the end of the day came from haggling over $100 invoices. In reality, I was untangling multi-million-dollar corporate embezzlement schemes while he sat on the couch complaining about his mid-level sales targets. The true irony of his text message was the house, the beautiful suburban home where he was currently celebrating his newfound freedom with Naomi. When we decided to move into that house 5 years ago, Liam bragged to all our friends about his negotiating skills. He boasted about finding a private landlord who offered a great deal. He proudly took on the role of the provider and insisted he pay the monthly rent while I used my small income for groceries. Liam did not find a private landlord. I did. I orchestrated the entire thing. The property management company Liam dealt with was a subsidiary of my primary LLC. The legal owner of that gorgeous house was me. Every month for the past 5 years, Liam had puffed up his chest, logged into his bank account, and confidently wired $3,000 to his landlord. He thought he was putting a roof over my head. He thought he was taking care of his poor wife. He never realized that every single one of those rent checks went straight into my corporate business account. I was his landlord. I had been heavily subsidizing his lifestyle for half a decade. The cars, the vacations, the premium health insurance we enjoyed. My corporate accounts quietly covered all the gaps his average salary could not bridge. I looked back down at the phone, resting on the cheap motel bedspread. Do not expect a single dime from me. The sheer comedy of his threat was intoxicating. Liam was a man standing on a trap door while proudly holding the rope that would release the lever. Naomi thought she had stolen a wealthy, successful executive. She thought she had leveled up her life by moving into his beautiful home. They were both living in a fantasy world entirely funded and controlled by the woman they had just betrayed. I opened my email client and drafted a quick message to my legal team instructing them to prepare the first round of unsealing documents. The time for hiding behind my careful disguise was officially over. The trap was meticulously set, and Liam had just handed me the absolute perfect reason to spring it. I closed the laptop and felt a deep, serene, calm wash over my entire body. The financial war had just begun, but I already held the winning hand, and they were about to lose everything. The morning sun bled through the cheap motel blinds, casting harsh lines across the scuffed linoleum floor. I had not slept a single minute, but I felt completely energized. The adrenaline of heartbreak had entirely evaporated, replaced by cold, calculating purpose. I poured a cup of bitter motel coffee, opened my secure laptop, and initiated a video call with Harrison. Harrison was 55 years old, a veteran divorce attorney who had seen every variation of human betrayal. He was sharp, pragmatic, and incredibly expensive. We had kept my business structure airtight for years, but navigating a divorce required a completely different kind of legal warfare. When his face appeared on my screen, I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him exactly what I caught Liam doing in my master bedroom. Harrison sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose, fully expecting a chaotic, drawn-out legal battle over assets and alimony. He started outlining strategies to freeze joint accounts and demand spousal support. I cut him off immediately. I told him I did not want spousal support. I did not want half of Liam's average retirement fund. I wanted a swift, uncontested, no-fault divorce filed before noon. I instructed Harrison to draft the initial settlement offer, making it abundantly clear that I was walking away with nothing but my personal belongings. Harrison looked at me through the screen with intense skepticism. He warned me that walking away without demanding a financial audit was highly unusual and could leave me vulnerable. I smiled and reminded him of the corporate trust structures protecting my actual wealth. I explained that if we demanded a full financial discovery, Liam's cheap strip mall lawyer might accidentally stumble upon the web of LLCs that led back to my cybersecurity firm. We needed Liam to sign the separation agreement blind. We needed him to feel so utterly victorious that he would sprint to the notary without reading the fine print. Harrison understood the strategy perfectly. A predator does not inspect the trap when the bait is handed over willingly. He promised to have the petition filed by 11, with the legal machinery in motion. I picked up my phone to execute the next phase of the psychological operation. Liam was expecting a fight. He was waiting for me to beg to scream to demand half the equity in the house he falsely believed we were renting. I denied him the battle. I opened our text thread and typed a message carefully designed to feed his massive, fragile ego. The house is yours. I do not want any of your money. I am moving on. I hit send and tossed the phone onto the bed. It took less than 3 minutes for his reply to come through. Glad you finally understand reality. I will have my lawyer send over the paperwork. Do not try to come back for anything else. Naomi is moving her things in today. The sheer audacity of moving his mistress into our home less than 24 hours after I walked out was breathtaking. He was not just replacing me. He was erasing me. He wanted to claim the kingdom and install a new queen before the sheets were even washed. It was a spectacular display of arrogance, and it played absolutely perfectly into my hands. I opened a secure browser and navigated to a blank social media account I used for running background checks on corporate executives. I searched for Naomi's public profile. She was a public relations director, meaning her entire existence was curated for public consumption. She thrived on validation and attention. I knew she would not be able to resist broadcasting her perceived victory to the world. I was right. Naomi had just posted a news story. The image loaded on my screen, and the irony was so thick, I could practically taste it. It was a video taken from the center of my living room. Naomi was lounging on the custom Italian leather sofa I had secretly paid for wearing a silk robe. She held a crystal flute of expensive champagne. In the background, Liam was walking through the kitchen looking incredibly pleased with himself. Naomi panned the camera around the spacious sunlit room, making sure to capture the vated ceilings and the expensive artwork hanging on the walls. The caption pasted across the bottom of the video read, simply, "Upgrades." They were toasting to their brilliant deception. Naomi genuinely believed she had stolen a highly successful executive and claimed his luxurious lifestyle. She thought she had evicted the boring, unambitious bookkeeper and taken her rightful place at the top of the suburban hierarchy. Liam genuinely believed he had successfully discarded a financial burden while maintaining his image as a wealthy provider. They thought they had won the war without firing a single shot. They were celebrating their grand victory inside a house owned entirely by my corporate trust. They were sipping champagne purchased with money I allowed Liam to keep. They were sitting on furniture my company had expensed. I watched the video loop 3 times, studying the smug satisfaction radiating from Naomi's face. If you fight a narcissist, they become defensive and cautious. They hire aggressive lawyers and scrutinize every single document. But if you surrender, if you hand them the crown and walk away, they become intoxicated by their own perceived brilliance. They get sloppy. They get greedy. And when people get greedy, they make catastrophic mistakes. I closed the browser, feeling a profound sense of peace settle over me. My phone buzzed with an email notification from Harrison confirming the no-fault divorce petition had been officially filed with the county clerk. The countdown had officially begun. Liam and Naomi were busy playing house, completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet was nothing but a trapdoor, waiting for me to pull the lever. I gathered my duffel bag and walked out of the cheap motel. I did not belong here, and I certainly did not belong in the passenger seat of Liam's manufactured life. I started the engine of my old Honda, leaving the motel behind. I drove towards the city, watching the suburban landscape fade into towering glass and steel. My actual office was located in a highly secure building downtown, guarded by biometric scanners and strict non-disclosure agreements. As I navigated the morning traffic, my mind was already racing ahead to the next logistical steps. I needed to isolate my assets completely. I needed to monitor their financial movements without triggering any alarms. Liam assumed I would be paralyzed by grief, crying in a dark room, and mourning the loss of our 10 years together. He fundamentally misunderstood the woman he married. Grief requires a foundation of love and respect. Liam had obliterated that foundation the moment he brought another woman into my sanctuary. There was no grief left to process. There was only a cold, calculating desire for absolute justice. I parked in my reserved underground spot, swiped my security badge, and stepped into the elevator. The doors closed, sealing me inside the very world Liam thought I was too small to inhabit. He wanted a divorce. I was going to give him an execution. 2 weeks passed before we sat in the mediation room. The conference room in downtown Portland was incredibly sterile and brutally cold, smelling faintly of cheap lemon cleaner old paper and stale morning coffee. Harrison sat beside me, his expensive tailored suit, a sharp contrast to my purposely worn-out gray cardigan. I was maintaining the pathetic costume just a little longer. Liam strutted in 10 minutes late. He wore a dark navy suit he had undoubtedly put on the joint credit card months ago. Beside him walked his lawyer, a man who looked like he bought his law degree from a late-night television commercial. Through the thick, frosted glass walls of the conference room, I could clearly see Naomi sitting in the brightly lit waiting area just beyond the heavy glass doors. She had crossed her long legs and was flipping through a magazine, periodically glancing up to shoot a smug, triumphant smile in my direction. She wanted to make sure I saw her. She wanted me to know she had won the ultimate prize, securing a man she believed would fund her lavish lifestyle forever. Liam sat down directly across from me with a heavy, highly dramatic sigh, acting like my mere presence was an unbearable inconvenience to his very busy executive schedule. His lawyer opened a thin manila folder and immediately launched into a rehearsed speech about an equitable split. Equitable was apparently highly subjective in their minds. Liam wanted to retain full possession of all the high-end electronics, the car, and the house he still believed we were renting. Then came his ultimate demand. His lawyer slid a single document across the polished oak table outlining a joint credit card balance of $15,000. Liam leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, trying to look imposing and authoritative. He looked down his nose at me. He told me that since he had completely carried me financially for the last 5 years of our marriage, paying the rent and keeping a roof over my head, the absolute least I could do was take on this minor debt. He claimed he needed a clean slate to build his new life, and that forcing him to pay this off would be an unjust punishment for a marriage that simply ran its course. The sheer audacity of his speech was truly staggering. He was sitting in a building that my firm actively audited, demanding I pay off the very credit card he likely used to fund his affair, all while lecturing me on financial responsibility. I glanced at Harrison, My attorney had to physically bite the inside of his cheek to stop himself from laughing out loud. Harrison had spent the last 2 weeks reviewing my corporate tax returns. He knew my liquid assets alone could buy the entire logistics firm Liam worked for. Yet here was this arrogant middle manager treating me like a desperate charity case. I did not argue. I did not shed a single tear or raise my voice in protest. I simply reached out, picked up the silver pen, and looked directly into Liam's eyes. I told him I would take the debt. I agreed to take the full $15,000 balance without a single condition or complaint. Liam's lawyer actually blinked in confusion. He had clearly prepared for a bitter, protracted fight. He had a stack of counterarguments ready to deploy, expecting me to cry and beg for a fair division of the debt. When I agreed instantly, the man looked at Liam as if he had just miraculously won the lottery. He thought I was a pushover. He thought I was a broken, intimidated woman who simply lacked the energy and the resources to fight back. The next step was the most crucial part of my entire strategy. Because I had capitulated so easily on the debt and relinquished any claim to the physical property in the house, Harrison smoothly slid the waiver of financial discovery across the table. In a standard divorce, both parties undergo a rigorous audit of all bank accounts, investments, and physical assets. I needed Liam to waive this right completely. If his cheap lawyer dug into my financials, they would uncover the anonymous corporate accounts, the offshore investments, and the blind trusts. Harrison presented the waiver to Liam's lawyer, framing it as a simple way to expedite the divorce process and keep things clean. He reminded them that my income was virtually non-existent compared to Liam's impressive executive salary. He suggested that dragging out financial discovery would only cost Liam more in legal fees for absolutely no return. Liam did not even hesitate. His eagerness to officially close the chapter on our marriage and begin his new upgraded life with Naomi blinded him completely. He snatched the pen from his lawyer and scribbled his signature across the document with aggressive, triumphant strokes. He signed away his right to investigate my finances. He signed away any potential claim to the massive fortune I had built during our marriage. By trying to saddle me with a minor credit card debt, he had legally locked himself out of millions of dollars. Through the glass partition, I saw Liam give Naomi a swift thumbs up. She beamed, adjusting her designer handbag, secure in her delusion. Liam tossed the pen back onto the table and stood up, adjusting his suit jacket with a final arrogant tug. He told me it was good doing business with me and advised me to find a better-paying job so I could handle the payments. I remained seated as they walked out of the room. I gathered the signed documents, feeling the heavy, satisfying weight of the paper in my hands. The $15,000 debt was not a burden. It was the master key to my next strike. Taking sole ownership of that joint account gave me full, unhindered legal access to the complete transaction history. Liam had just handed me the exact financial weapon I needed to destroy his career. I watched the heavy glass doors swing shut behind them, sealing their fate. My smile finally reached my eyes. The trap was fully locked into place and they walked right in. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind them, sealing their fate. My cold smile finally reached my tired eyes. The trap was fully locked into place, and they walked right in. I watched them leave the building through the large window. This was the absolute best possible outcome for me. Harrison waited until the elevator bank pinged, signaling Liam and his discount lawyer were officially gone. He let out a long, heavy exhale and reached for his leather briefcase. Throughout our preparation, Harrison knew I wanted to expedite the process and avoid discovery. He knew I had my reasons for capitulating on the debt, but he had not yet seen the complete picture. I had promised him full transparency only after Liam signed the waiver. I unzipped my duffel bag and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. I slid it across the polished oak table. Harrison adjusted his glasses and broke the seal. He pulled out the stack of financial disclosures I had meticulously prepared. These were the real documents, the ones detailing the intricate web of my corporate entities, the offshore holdings, and the blind trust that protected my cybersecurity firm. The room was silent. save for the rustle of heavy paper. I watched Harrison's eyes scan the first page. His brow furrowed. He flipped to the second page, and his reading speed slowed to a crawl. By the time he reached the summary of my primary holding company, his jaw physically dropped. The solid silver pen slipped from his fingers and clattered loudly against the oak table. It rolled off the edge and hit the floor. But Harrison did not even flinch. He just stared at the final figure printed at the bottom of the page. "You make hundreds of thousands of dollars a year," Harrison said. His voice stripped of all its usual courtroom polish. It was barely above a whisper. He looked up from the paper, his eyes wide with absolute shock. "You own the house he lives in. You own the property management company that collects his rent. Does he really not know?" "Not a single clue," I replied, my voice steady and completely calm. "He thinks I balance spreadsheets for a local bakery and struggle to pay for groceries. He thinks his logistics salary makes him the undisputed king of the household." Harrison shook his head in sheer disbelief. "In 30 years, I have never seen a spouse successfully conceal a financial empire right under the nose of someone they lived with for a decade. How did you hide this wealth?" "I am a forensic accountant and cybersecurity expert. Harrison, my career is built on tracking hidden money. Hiding my assets from a man who barely understands his credit card statement was the easiest job I have undertaken." Long before Liam and I walked down the aisle, I established blind trusts. I recognized his fragile ego and his constant need to feel superior. I knew that if he discovered my true earning power, he would either resent me or leech off me until I had nothing left. To prevent that, I structured my companies through anonymous limited liability companies. The most crucial piece was the prenuptial protections woven into our marriage from day one. I did not ask Liam to sign a traditional prenuptial agreement because that would have triggered a massive confrontation. Instead, I kept our finances aggressively separate. I ensured my name never touched his bank accounts. My corporate trust purchased our home and my property management subsidiary leased it to him. Every significant asset was legally isolated from our marital estate. Harrison picked up his pen. He looked at the waiver of financial discovery Liam had just signed. "He just gave it all up," Harrison said, "by rushing to finalize this agreement and waiving a forensic audit. He legally cemented the division of your assets exactly as they stand today. He locked himself out of your fortune." I smiled broadly. Liam was so eager to trap me with a $15,000 debt that he forfeited millions. He thought he was throwing me an anchor, but he cut the only rope that could save him from drowning. Desperation makes people sloppy, I noted. Liam is desperate to prove to Naomi that he is a wealthy executive. I just gave him the illusion of victory so he would run straight into a wall. Harrison gathered the real documents into his briefcase. The legal trap was flawless. He confirmed the divorce will be finalized swiftly because he waived discovery. He gets the debt, and you walk away with your empire intact. I quickly thanked Harrison. He played the concerned lawyer perfectly, making Liam feel dominant. We shook hands and I walked out of the office feeling lighter. The heavy weight of playing a lesser version of myself was lifted. I stepped out onto the bustling city street. The cold wind whipped against my face, but I did not feel the chill. I pulled my phone from my pocket and checked my secure corporate dashboard. The rent payment from Liam had just cleared my holding company's account. He had paid for his month of living in my house with the woman he betrayed me for. The financial separation was now a matter of legal record. The uncontested divorce was practically finished. But my work was far from over. Securing my fortune and protecting my assets was merely the defensive phase of my strategy. Now that Liam had officially signed away his right to look into my world, I was completely free to look into his. I had accepted the $15,000 credit card debt, and with it, I now had unrestricted legal access to the transaction history. I hailed a cab and directed the driver to my secure office building. It was finally time to switch from defense to a brutal offense. It was time to see exactly how Liam and Naomi were funding their new upgraded reality. I walked into the quiet hum of my secure office and locked the reinforced steel door behind me. The transition from the public streets to my private sanctuary always sharpened my focus. I dropped my coat on a leather chair, sat at my multi-monitor workstation, and woke up the servers. The large screens illuminated the dark room with lines of scrolling data. It was time to see exactly how Liam and Naomi were funding their new, upgraded reality. I pulled the joint credit card account information from my settlement documents and logged into the bank portal. Because Liam had legally transferred the debt to me just hours earlier, I now possessed unrestricted authorization to request the complete, unredacted transaction history. I downloaded 5 years of statements directly into my forensic analysis software. My algorithms immediately began sorting the data, highlighting anomalies, categorizing expenditures, and flagging suspicious vendor codes. I leaned back and watched the patterns emerge across my monitors. The $15,000 balance was not accumulated through standard household expenses or weekend getaways. A small portion covered the luxury hotels and expensive dinners Liam used to woo Naomi behind my back. However, the vast majority of the debt consisted of highly specific bizarre charges that made absolutely no sense for a mid-level logistics manager. There were recurring payments to digital marketing platforms, expensive press release distribution services, and web hosting conglomerates. I saw thousands of dollars routed to a boutique branding agency in Los Angeles. I highlighted the transactions and cross-referenced the vendor identification codes. Every single one of these expenses pointed directly toward public relations infrastructure. Liam was not just taking Naomi on fancy dates. He was actively financing her failing PR startup using the credit card tied to my name. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Liam was foolish, but he was inherently stingy with his own money. He would never take on massive personal debt for someone else's business unless there was a larger financial mechanism at play. The $15,000 on this card was just the overflow. It was the sloppy residue of a much larger financial operation. I opened a secure terminal and initiated a deep dive sweep across all major credit bureaus. I pulled my complete credit profile, running a forensic trace on my social security number. I had always kept my primary identity locked down under corporate shields, but my basic citizen profile was still active for standard tax purposes. Liam knew exactly where I kept my old tax returns in the locked filing cabinet of our home office. The credit report loaded onto my central screen. I scanned the active accounts. My mortgage for the holding company was perfectly clean. My corporate lines of credit were flawlessly managed. Then my eyes caught a glaring red anomaly sitting right in the middle of the liabilities section. It was a commercial business loan. The principal amount was $80,000. I sat perfectly still. The only sound in the room was the gentle whirring of my computer cooling fans. I clicked on the loan details, tracking the origination date. It had been finalized 8 months ago, right around the time Liam started acting distant and working late. The lender was a mid-tier commercial bank known for fast approvals on small business loans. I bypassed standard inquiry protocols and used my firm's backdoor access to the bank's digital registry. I pulled the original loan origination documents. The files downloaded instantly. I opened the application and stared at the screen in absolute disbelief. The borrower listed on the $80,000 loan was Naomi's public relations firm. The primary guarantor listed was Liam, but Liam's average credit score and unimpressive salary would never secure an $8,000 commercial loan on his own. He needed a co-signer with impeccable credit and a zero debt-to-income ratio. He needed me. I scrolled down to the signature page. There, sitting next to Liam's messy scrawl and Naomi's elegant cursive, was my name. It was a digital signature authenticated by an IP address originating from my own home network. Liam had waited until I was out of the house, logged onto our home computer, typed in my social security number, uploaded copies of my old tax returns, and forged my digital signature to act as the financial anchor for his mistress's business. This was not just a messy divorce anymore. This was not a simple case of a cheating husband trying to impress his new girlfriend. By using my social security number and forging my signature on a commercial lending document across state lines, Liam had committed identity theft. By transmitting those fraudulent documents through a digital banking portal, he had committed federal wire fraud. Naomi was entirely complicit. Her signature sat right next to the forged authorization. She had accepted $80,000 of stolen capital to fund her vain attempt at being a successful entrepreneur. They had anchored their entire upgraded life to my stolen identity, believing I was too naive and too powerless to ever uncover the truth. I began pulling the routing numbers attached to the loan disbursement. The $80,000 had been deposited directly into a business checking account controlled by Naomi. From there, I tracked the outward flow of the capital. She had burned through the funds with astonishing speed. There were massive payments for a lavish downtown office lease, thousands spent on luxury furniture, and exorbitant invoices for vanity marketing campaigns that yielded absolutely zero return on investment. Naomi's business was not just failing. It was a catastrophic financial sinkhole. Liam had tied my identity to a sinking ship, desperate to buy the affection of a woman whose ambition vastly exceeded her actual talent. I compiled every single transaction into a master dossier. I color-coded the fraudulent transfers, highlighting the exact path the stolen money took from the commercial bank to Naomi's personal vanity projects. I created a timeline matching the dates of the loan origination to the days Liam claimed he was working late at the logistics firm. The evidence was irrefutable, crystal clear, and completely damning. A predatory thrill rushed through my veins. If Liam had just walked away, if he had simply asked for a divorce and admitted his affair, I might have just let him leave. I would have kept my house and moved on with my quiet, successful life. But he decided to use my identity as his personal bank. He decided to drag my pristine financial record into his dirty, pathetic lies. He crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Federal wire fraud carries a minimum sentence of up to 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Identity theft adds mandatory consecutive prison time. Liam thought he was outsmarting a broke bookkeeper. He had no idea he had just handed a forensic accounting expert the exact evidence needed to send him and his mistress to a federal prison. I saved the loan documents, the IP address logs, and the forged signature files to an encrypted flash drive. I secured the master dossier inside a heavily encrypted folder on my secure server. I locked the system down, ensuring no one could access the data without my biometric clearance. The civil divorce was merely a distraction. Now the real war was criminal, and I possessed all the ammunition. It was time to call in my family. It was time to bring in the heavy artillery and show Liam exactly what happens when you try to steal from someone who builds financial fortresses for a living. I stood up from my workstation, feeling a surge of unstoppable power. Liam wanted a clean slate. I was going to give him a federal indictment. My phone violently vibrated against the polished surface of my desk, snapping my attention away from the glowing monitors. It was not an email from Harrison, nor was it an alert from my bank. The screen was flooded with notifications from a private messaging application. It was the Thursday Night Crew. This was our core group of mutual friends, 5 couples who had gathered for board games, expensive wine, and backyard barbecues every single week for the past 4 years. We had celebrated birthdays together, attended each other's weddings, and shared intimate details of our lives. I unlocked the screen and opened the group chat. A massive block of text from Naomi sat at the very bottom, tagged with high importance. I read through her fabricated narrative, my eyebrows rising higher with every single sentence. Naomi had struck first in the court of public opinion, launching a vicious, highly calculated smear campaign designed to completely rewrite the reality of my departure. She spun a story so detached from the truth that it belonged in a psychological thriller. According to Naomi's dramatic, tear-filled paragraphs, I had suffered a severe, Terrifying mental breakdown. She claimed Liam had caught me stealing thousands of dollars from his personal savings accounts to fund a secret shopping addiction and pay off massive hidden debts. She painted Liam as the heartbroken, exhausted husband who had tried absolutely everything to save my sanity, only to be forced to kick me out of our home for his own financial and physical safety. Naomi graciously cast herself as the supportive best friend, stepping in, merely to comfort a devastated man in his darkest hour of need. The ripple effect was instantaneous and brutal. The replies from people I considered close friends poured in like toxic venom. The messages piled up, creating a digital avalanche of sheer condemnation. A woman named Rachel, someone I had spent 3 days nursing through a terrible flu last winter, typed that I was utterly disgusting. A man whose resume I had personally redesigned to help him land his current job wrote that he could not believe they ever let someone so toxic into their homes. They all agreed that Liam deserved so much better and praised Naomi for being an absolute saint for stepping up to help him heal. My personal direct messages began pinging simultaneously. The people I had cooked dinner for, the people I had comforted through their own marital crisis were now eagerly lining up to throw stones. They called me unhinged. They told me to seek immediate psychiatric help. They demanded I surrender my keys to the house and never contact any of them again. Any normal person might have shattered under the crushing weight of this collective betrayal. A lesser woman would have frantically typed out massive paragraphs of defense, uploading screenshots, and begging her friends to believe the actual truth. I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel a sliver of heartbreak. Instead, I felt an overwhelming, powerful sense of absolute liberation. The trash was effectively taking itself out, saving me the trouble of hauling it to the curb. I did not reply with anger. I did not offer a single word of explanation or defense. I systematically opened every single contact who had sent me a hateful message. I pressed block. I deleted the conversation. Block. Delete. Block. Delete. I severed ties with an entire decade of social connections in less than 5 minutes. Absolute suffocating silence is a weapon that narcissists and manipulators simply cannot comprehend. By refusing to engage, I starved Naomi of the dramatic, messy fallout she desperately craved. She wanted a public war of words. She wanted me to look crazy. I gave her an impenetrable void. I turned my phone on silent mode, tossed it into a heavy desk drawer, and directed my full, undivided attention back to my glowing monitors. The court of public opinion was entirely irrelevant to me now. Let them have their Thursday game nights and their cheap wine. Let them rally around a fake executive and his identity-thieving mistress. I was operating in the realm of federal law, and my audience would soon be a panel of federal judges and corporate board members. I needed to ensure every single piece of evidence was forensically sound and legally admissible. I booted up an isolated virtual machine and navigated to Naomi's public profiles. She was currently posting photos of herself and Liam holding hands at a local coffee shop playing the role of the triumphant weary survivors. I initiated a secure screen capture protocol documenting every single post, every timestamp, and every comment praising her bravery. Her social media smear campaign was not just a pathetic attempt at social climbing. In the eyes of the law, it was documented, widely published defamation. It was written, irrefutable evidence of libel and slander. She was publicly assassinating my character, adding yet another highly lucrative layer of civil liability to her impending financial ruin. I saved the digital captures into a new folder labeled defamation suit. I then deepened the forensic trace. I cross-referenced the timestamp of her defamatory posts with the timestamp of the fraudulent commercial loan origination. I built a master digital timeline on my largest screen. I mapped out the exact IP addresses, tracking the geolocation data of the forged signature back to the router in my former living room. I pulled the background metadata from Liam's company laptop, proving he was actively logged into his corporate VPN from that exact same IP address at the exact same moment my signature was forged on the loan documents. There was no shadow of a doubt left. There was no room for plausible deniability. The digital footprint I had compiled was an absolute concrete wall that neither Liam nor Naomi could ever climb over. As the heavy office printer hummed to life, churning out thick stacks of hard copies detailing the federal wire fraud and identity theft, I leaned back in my leather chair. This war required a completely different kind of general. Harrison was a brilliant attorney for navigating a divorce, but identity theft, corporate embezzlement, and federal wire fraud required ruthless, aggressive corporate litigation. I needed a shark who thrived on absolute destruction. I needed my family. My mobile phone chirped twice a distinct sharp alert that signaled an incoming encrypted transmission. It was a message from Jasmine. She had bypassed the commercial airline chaos, entirely opting for a private charter. The timing was perfect. By the time I walked out to my car, their taxi was already pulling into the drop-off zone. Seeing my brother Ethan and my sister-in-law Jasmine standing on the sidewalk was the first time I felt a genuine flicker of warmth in days. Ethan looked the same as ever, a mountain of a man with a steady protective energy. But it was Jasmine who commanded the space around them. She looked immaculate in a sharp slate-gray power suit that could have sliced through steel. She wasn't carrying a purse. She carried two bulky, heavy-duty briefcases secured with combination locks. I drove them back to my secure apartment building. The ride was short, but packed with intensity. They had seen the news. They had heard about the storm, the hospital, and the sheer audacity of my family's social media performance. Ethan reached over from the front passenger seat, resting a massive hand on my shoulder. He didn't say anything, but the firm pressure of his grip conveyed everything he felt about the people who had abandoned me. Jasmine, however, didn't waste time on sentiment. She cracked open the first briefcase on her lap before we had even left the airport parking structure. She laid out a preliminary map of federal statutes that applied to Liam and Naomi's specific actions. Once we reached my home office, the atmosphere shifted to full operational mode. This room was my command center, a place where the air always felt charged with cold, digital efficiency. Jasmine didn't offer a hug or a tissue. She walked straight to my desk, set the briefcases down with a satisfying metallic thud, and began laying out her documents like a general deploying troops on a battlefield. I watched her work. She was a corporate litigation specialist known for dismantling conglomerate structures. Seeing her talent applied to my messy personal nightmare felt like watching a master craftsman sharpen a blade. "We aren't going to cry," Jasmine declared, her voice dropping into that calm, terrifyingly precise tone she used before a deposition. "We are going to subpoena them into the Stone Age." She handed me a draft of the lawsuit she had been working on during the flight. It wasn't just a divorce filing. It was an all-out assault on every financial move Liam and Naomi had made for the last 3 years. She had already prepared motions to force the disclosure of every bank account, every deleted email, and every hidden transaction associated with Naomi's startup. I pulled up the master dossier I had created on my monitors. When Jasmine saw the forensic timeline I had mapped out connecting Liam's IP address to the forged loan application, she let out a low, impressed whistle. She didn't see a victim in front of her. She saw a fellow strategist. We began the war room phase of the operation. We needed to be surgical. Jasmine organized the destruction into 3 distinct phases: financial isolation, reputational demolition, and federal prosecution. First, we mapped out in the financial isolation. Jasmine reviewed the contract for the house. Since the property management firm was my subsidiary, we had absolute leverage. She drafted a formal notice of lease termination for non-payment of rent, specifically citing the unauthorized structural renovations Naomi had been bragging about on Instagram. We didn't just want them out. We wanted them to have no financial foothold to fight back. We planned to trigger a breach of contract clause that would make them liable for the full restoration costs of the house. Second, we tackled the reputational demolition. I showed Jasmine the screenshots of the smear campaign. Her eyes glinted with predatory focus. Lyle and slander were her specialties. She drafted a cease and desist letter that read more like a death sentence for Naomi's public relations career. It demanded a public retraction of every lie under penalty of a defamation lawsuit that would effectively bankrupt Naomi for the next decade. If Naomi wanted to play the influencer game, Jasmine was going to ensure the House of Cards collapsed while the world was watching. Third, and most importantly, we finalized the federal prosecution plan. I walked Jasmine through the wire fraud evidence. We prepared a package for the United States Attorney's Office, complete with the bank-certified digital signatures, the loan disbursement logs, and the metadata connecting Liam to the forgery. We weren't just going to win the divorce. We were going to trigger a federal investigation that would see Liam lose his professional license, his corporate standing, and his freedom. We aren't just going to win Jasmine, repeated pacing the room as she finalized our list of contacts at the bank. We are going to make it impossible for them to ever work in the tech or logistics sector again. Every bank, every lender, and every future employer would see the red flags we were about to raise. We spent hours in that room debating wording, checking jurisdiction laws, and refining the timeline of their demise. The air was thick with the scent of high-grade printer toner and the electric hum of server racks. For every cruel text message Liam had sent, for every smug video Naomi had posted, we had a corresponding legal document ready to be filed. The strategy was airtight. Liam was a man who lived for the appearance of success, and we were about to strip that away, until only the cold, harsh reality of his fraud remained. As the clock pushed past midnight, the weight of the last few days began to lift from my chest. I wasn't just an accountant anymore. I was a target who had picked up a sniper rifle. I looked at Ethan and Jasmine, feeling a surge of gratitude that cut through the exhaustion. I had been fighting this war alone, and now I had the smartest, meanest legal mind in the country on my side. We weren't going to cry about Liam and his mistress. We were going to systematically dismantle their lives until they wished they had never met me. The plan was set. Tomorrow, we would begin the countdown to their total destruction. Section 9, 1,000 words. The war room atmosphere of the office was still thick with the smell of toner, but the focus shifted back to my monitors. Jasmine and Ethan watched over my shoulder as I bypassed standard security protocols to perform a deep-dive forensic audit on the logistics firm's corporate financial ledger. I didn't need a search warrant. I had built the company's internal security architecture myself 3 years ago, and my master administrative credentials were still active. Liam was an arrogant executive who thought his passwords were secure, but he had no concept of how I navigated the back end of the enterprise software he relied on daily. I pulled up the vendor payment logs from the last fiscal quarter. Liam managed the regional distribution accounts, overseeing payments to independent shipping contractors and specialized warehouse service providers. I filtered the data for any outgoing transactions exceeding $5,000. The software quickly generated a list. Most of the entries looked legitimate. Fuel costs, maintenance fees, port tariffs. Then a single flag transaction caught my attention. It was a wire transfer for exactly $30,000. Routed to a high-end jewelry house based in Chicago. The vendor name listed in the ledger was an obscure logistics supply firm that didn't exist in any of our official partner registries. I checked the routing number and the internal project code associated with the payment. It was coded as an emergency equipment replacement fee. I pulled up the accompanying invoice file attached to the transaction. It was a digital PDF. Obviously photoshopped, containing a string of gibberish serial numbers and a fake company letterhead. I leaned forward, my pulse quickening. Liam hadn't just used our joint account for small-time credit card charges. He was looting his own employer to fund his fantasy life with Naomi. I cross-referenced the transaction date with the social media posts I had archived from Naomi's profile. On the morning the wire transfer was initiated, Naomi had posted a photo of a velvet blue jewelry box with the caption, "True love is forever." The $30,000 wasn't for warehouse equipment. It was a diamond engagement ring. Jasmine inhaled sharply as the screen updated, displaying the bank destination for the stolen funds. It was a personal account held by the same jewelry house, confirming that the money hadn't been filtered through a legitimate vendor, but had been stolen directly from the company's operating capital. Liam hadn't used his savings. He had embezzled these funds under the guise of corporate operations. He was a corporate thief. The stakes hit the ceiling instantly. Embezzlement from a publicly traded logistics company was not just a fireable offense. It was a massive high-level felony. This transformed my personal vendetta into a potential corporate scandal that could implicate the entire logistics firm if they didn't act quickly. Liam's arrogance had blinded him to the most basic audit trails. He thought he was untouchable because he held the title of director, never realizing that every cent he funneled out of that company left a permanent, unalterable digital fingerprint on the servers I had architected. I began pulling the logs for all similar transactions from the past year. As the audit ran, a pattern emerged. Small, incremental thefts had been escalating. Liam had started with a few thousand here and there disguised as miscellaneous shipping surcharges, then escalated to larger fraudulent vendor payments. The total amount he had siphoned was over $120,000. He was using the company as his own personal piggy bank to subsidize a lifestyle he could never afford on his salary. I felt a surge of cold, analytical satisfaction. Liam believed I was the one who was going to struggle after the divorce. He thought he was walking away with his job and his reputation intact, while I limped toward financial failure. He was so busy positioning himself as the successful, wealthy executive that he failed to secure the evidence of his own crimes. He didn't just break my heart. He broke the law in a way that guaranteed his destruction. Jasmine began making rapid notes on her legal pad, her expression transitioning from analytical to predatory. She knew exactly what this meant. If we leak this audit directly to the logistics firm's board of directors, they would have no choice but to terminate him immediately and initiate federal criminal proceedings to avoid liability themselves. We wouldn't even have to lift a finger to destroy his career. The corporate entity would do the heavy lifting for us. I turned the monitors toward Jasmine. You have the leverage you need to ensure the firm's board initiates a full-scale audit. Once they see the discrepancy between these fake invoices and the actual shipping data, Liam won't have a leg to stand on. He won't just be fired. He'll be under investigation by the Department of Justice before the week is out. Ethan stood in silence, his jaw set in a hard line. He had always been quiet, but his loyalty was absolute. He asked if we needed more support from the local side, but I told him we had everything under control. The digital trap was now complete. We had the evidence of identity theft, the proof of wire fraud, and now the irrefutable documentation of corporate embezzlement. I exported the entire dataset into a password-protected cloud storage container. I created a secondary backup on an encrypted hard drive. I wasn't just planning to win, I was planning to annihilate his existence as a functioning member of society. Every luxury item he bought Naomi, every champagne toast, every smug, upgraded social media post was paid for with capital that would eventually serve as the primary evidence in his felony trial. As I shut down the forensic software, the office seemed to grow darker, the silence heavy with the coming storm. Liam thought he was the architect of his new life, but he was merely a tenant in a burning building. I had set a light from the inside. I looked at Jasmine, and for the first time that night, we both shared a genuine, terrifying smile. The forensic audit was done. The truth was gathered. Tomorrow, the logistics firm's board of directors would receive an anonymous comprehensive dossier that would turn their entire regional operation upside down. We had finished the work of the hunter. Now we simply had to wait for the prey to realize the trap had already closed around him. The next morning began with a notification that made my blood run cold, though not for the reasons Naomi expected. My phone vibrated aggressively on the bedside table. I swiped the screen to see a new alert from Instagram. Naomi had just uploaded a 20-minute house tour video. The production quality was slick, heavily edited and dripping with manufactured luxury. She stood in the foyer of my old Victorian home, waving a manicured hand toward the custom molding I had painstakingly selected 2 years ago. She walked the audience through the kitchen, boasting about a high-end appliance upgrade that was clearly financed by a mountain of predatory interest. She lingered in the living room, panning the camera over the imported rug and the velvet chaise I had purchased during my first year as a forensic analyst. The video was a manifesto of stolen valor. She was presenting my taste, my home, and my financial labor as her own successful branding. Then she reached the crescendo of the video. She turned the camera toward herself, her face glowing with feigned modesty, and announced the date for their upcoming engagement party. It was to be held at the local country club, a venue that required a hefty membership fee and an even larger deposit. She talked about the guest list, the open bar, and the private DJ, practically gloating that this would be the most exclusive event of the season. She was positioning herself as the new queen of our social circle, funded entirely by the man she stole and the life she had usurped from me. The comment section was already filling up with praise from the very friends who had blocked me. They were fawning over the upgrades, congratulating Naomi on her impeccable taste and wishing her a lifetime of happiness with Liam. I watched the entire video with a detachment that surprised me. Every minute she spent showing off my hard work. I saw a roadmap of her downfall. She was making it incredibly easy to prove her level of involvement in the fraudulent household. But the time for passive observation was over. Jasmine and I watched the screen, our faces illuminated by the harsh blue light of the laptop. Jasmine leaned into the frame, her eyes tracking the specific rooms Naomi showcased. She pointed out that Naomi explicitly stated she was the one who authorized the renovations in the master suite and the guest kitchen. That statement was the final piece of evidence we needed to legally define her as a willful participant in the misappropriation of property. We weren't just dealing with an affair. We were dealing with a woman who had moved into my home and was actively destroying its infrastructure on credit. It was time to spring the trap. We needed to remove the corporate veil. Up until this moment, the house had been owned by a holding company to shield it from liability. This served its purpose during our marriage, but now it was an obstacle to the eviction process. By keeping the LLC as the owner, I gave Liam and Naomi a false sense of security, making them believe they were dealing with an impersonal corporate landlord that would be slow to act. I logged into the state's secure business portal. My fingers moved across the keyboard with the rhythmic precision of a concert pianist. I initiated the transfer of the property deed. It was a straightforward, albeit legally heavy process. I moved the ownership from the LLC directly into my own legal name. By doing this, I became the primary individual landlord. I was no longer a faceless entity. I was the woman they had scorned, and I was now the person standing between them and the roof over their heads. The corporate veil was gone. I wanted them to know exactly who was serving the notice. I wanted the name on the eviction documents to be mine. I wanted the fear they would feel when they read that notice to be personal. Jasmine watched the process, her expression one of grim approval. She finalized the legal paperwork to accompany the deed transfer. She had drafted a notice of default that was brutal in its clarity. It stated that the owner of the property, me, was now personally overseeing the lease agreement. It demanded an immediate cessation of all unapproved structural renovations. It also contained a clause requiring a full financial audit of the rental property as part of a routine insurance assessment. We knew Liam and Naomi wouldn't be able to provide the documentation for where they got the money for the renovations. We knew they wouldn't be able to justify the lack of rent payments during the months they were preparing for the wedding. We were essentially locking them in a room with a ticking bomb. I hit the submit button. The deed transfer was official. I took a deep breath, looking out the office window at the city skyline. I felt like a hunter who had just laid the final snare in the woods. They would spend their weekend planning their engagement party, buying flowers and arguing over seating charts, never realizing that I had just become their worst nightmare. Every expensive item they bought for that party, every cent they spent on the venue was money they should have been saving for the inevitable legal catastrophe. I was about to unleash. The trap was fully set. They were living in a house they thought they were renting from a company, but they were actually living in a house owned by the woman they had pushed aside. The game of house was officially over. Tomorrow, I would walk into that house and deliver the notice myself. I wanted to see their faces when they realized the broke bookkeeper wasn't just broke. She was their landlord, their judge, and their executioner. The upgrade they were so proud of was nothing more than a front-row seat to their own destruction. The time had come to stop the flow of oxygen to their synthetic dream. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I didn't feel a shred of hesitation. For 5 years, I had maintained a sophisticated financial pipeline. Liam thought his salary covered our comfortable life, but I was the one fueling the fire. I had automated payments that funneled funds into his high-end car insurance, a premium healthcare policy that covered his frequent athletic injuries, and the most critical component, the rent subsidy that made him believe he was a master negotiator. When he secured our home, I accessed the central hub of my private banking portal. With a single click, I disabled the primary autopay features. I didn't just stop the payments. I purged the credit card data, deleted the recurring transfer instructions, and locked the routing numbers. The pipeline went dry instantly. Liam was now entirely responsible for his own financial obligations. He would soon be driving a luxury car without insurance and relying on his own meager salary for medical coverage. The illusion of his success was about to face the cold, hard reality of his actual income. I checked the dashboard one last time to ensure the changes were irreversible. The bank verified the cancellation of the pre-authorized debits. I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. Liam had spent years building a persona on my dime, acting like a big-shot executive while I silently managed the accounts. Now he would be forced to look at his actual bank balance without the buffer of my wealth. Meanwhile, Naomi was busy living her best life in the city center. She was currently at an elite boutique, one of those places that require an appointment just to walk through the door. I knew this because her location was tagged on the digital tracking I had set up on her PR firm's business account. She was shopping for her engagement party dress, convinced that her life was finally ascending to the status she had always coveted. I monitored the transaction gateway in real time. She had selected a gown that cost over $4,000. She walked up to the counter laughing with the sales associate, her phone held up to record a story for her followers. She handed over the business credit card, the same one funded by the fraudulent $80,000 loan I had already flagged with Jasmine's legal team. I watched the authorization request hit the bank's terminal. I had already contacted the fraud department and provided the documentation showing the loan was obtained through identity theft. The bank's automated security system processed the request, looked at the fraud flag on the account, and instantly issued a decline. On the screen, I watched the status update from pending to rejected. Inside the boutique, Naomi's triumphant smile would have faltered. She likely tried the card again, perhaps assuming it was a simple glitch. I watched the second request go through. Denied. The bank had not just declined the transaction. They had triggered a full freeze on the entire business account. Naomi was standing at the register, surrounded by expensive silks and lace, with a card that was suddenly as useful as a piece of plastic junk. The sales associate would be looking at her with that polite, condescending patience that retail workers reserve for people who cannot pay. Her followers would be watching her confidence evaporate in real time. She was public relations royalty, yet she couldn't afford a dress for her own party. But the collapse didn't stop there. Jasmine had worked her magic overnight. She had sent a formal demand letter to the commercial bank that issued the $80,000 loan. The letter detailed that the loan was guaranteed by a forged signature. The bank, terrified of federal wire fraud liability, had immediately placed a mandatory hold on all associated business assets. Naomi's PR firm, which was already hemorrhaging money due to her lavish spending, was now completely gutted. I refreshed the monitor. The bank interface showed the account status as under regulatory review. Every dollar Naomi had moved through that account was now trapped. She was holding a $4,000 dress she couldn't buy, while her company bank account, the only thing separating her from her crushing personal debts, was effectively erased from existence. I sat back sipping my tea, watching the data stream. This was only the beginning of the domino effect. The engagement party was 3 days away. They had already sent out the invitations, ordered the catering, and booked the DJ. They had burned every cent of credit they had, thinking they had time to pay it off after the wedding. They had no idea that their entire financial ecosystem was built on sand. Liam was probably in a meeting, blissfully unaware that his car insurance policy was currently being canceled for non-payment. Naomi was likely storming out of the boutique, her reputation as a successful entrepreneur tarnished by a declined card and a failed transaction. They were standing in the middle of a disaster they had created themselves. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to send them a text message mocking them. The cold, hard numbers were doing the talking for me. I had cut the subsidies, flagged the fraud, and frozen the assets. Now they had to navigate the next 3 days with absolutely no safety net. They wanted a life of luxury and social clout. They were about to learn that when you build a kingdom on fraud, the fall is not just inevitable. It is fast, loud, and public. I closed the account portal and started preparing the next phase of the documents. The dominoes were falling, and I had a front-row seat to the collapse of everything they had stolen from me. The silence in my office was heavy, but it was no longer the silence of someone hiding. It was the silence of a victor preparing the final paperwork for their exit from my life. The mail arrived at exactly 10 in the morning, a ritual that had always been a quiet moment in our home. Today, it was a weapon. Liam pulled a heavy cream-colored envelope from the slot. It was marked with the official seal of the property management firm. He didn't recognize the return address because he never looked closely at the automated billing statements I had handled for years. He tore it open while walking toward the kitchen, expecting the usual generic updates or perhaps a notice about upcoming landscaping work. He stopped dead in his tracks before he reached the counter. The letter was a formal notice of lease modification and intent to terminate. The language was cold, precise, and devastating. Due to extensive unapproved structural renovations, the exact ones Naomi had boasted about on her social media channels. The property management company was exercising a clause that allowed for immediate reevaluation of the lease agreement. The rent was being increased by 300% effective immediately to account for the property's diminished state and the high cost of restoring it to the original condition. Beneath that stunning financial blow was the real hammer, a 14-day notice to vacate the premises. The letter cited a breach of contract based on the structural changes Naomi had filmed for her followers. It was an eviction notice. Liam's hands began to shake. He read the words a second time, then a third, his brain struggling to reconcile the reality on the paper with the life of luxury he thought he had secured. He didn't just lose the house. He lost the venue for the engagement party he had spent thousands of dollars planning. Everything was tied to this address. The caterers were scheduled to arrive here. The vendors were mailing supplies here. The invitation address was printed on every card currently sitting in the mailboxes of his friends and colleagues. Panic, thick and suffocating, took hold. He paced the living room, the letter crushed in his fist. He felt the walls of the home he thought he owned closing in on him. He didn't want to tell Naomi yet. She was already stressed about the declined credit card and the frozen business account. If he told her they were being evicted, She would go nuclear. He needed to handle this quietly. He needed to talk to the landlord. He pulled out his phone and dialed the number at the bottom of the letter. It was the same number I had used for years to coordinate minor repairs. It rang twice, 3 times, 4 times. Finally, a crisp, professional voice answered. "Thank you for calling Miller and Associates Property Management. Please hold for the next available representative." Liam paced the kitchen, his heart hammering against his ribs. He waited for several minutes, the hold music playing in his ear, his irritation growing by the second. He had 500 people to impress in 72 hours. He didn't have time for hold queues. The line clicked. "You have reached the office of Attorney Jasmine Miller. How can I direct your call?" Liam stopped walking. He blinked, confused. This was supposed to be a property management office. "Why did he reach a law firm? I am trying to reach the management office for my residence," Liam said. His voice strained. "I received a notice regarding my lease. I need to speak to someone in charge of rental properties. This is the firm handling the lease termination for that property." Confused. This was supposed to be a property management office. "Why did he reach a law firm? I am trying to reach the management office for my residence," Liam said. His voice strained. "I received a notice regarding my lease. I need to speak to someone in charge of rental properties. This is the firm handling the lease termination for that property." The paralegal replied, her voice completely devoid of emotion. Liam's chest tightened. He tried to project the arrogance that usually got him what he wanted at work. "Look, I am the tenant at the Beacon Hill property. There has been some sort of mistake with this notice. I have been paying my rent on time for years. I am a top-tier tenant. I need to speak to the landlord immediately to resolve this." The paralegal was silent for a beat. "I am sorry, sir, but the owner of the property has explicitly instructed us to handle all communication through this office. No direct contact with the owner is permitted under the terms of the termination notice." Liam wiped sweat from his forehead. It was freezing outside, but he felt like he was standing in the middle of a furnace. "Listen, I have an engagement party here in 3 days. I have guests arriving from out of town. You cannot evict me during my engagement party. This is absurd. Who is the landlord I want to name?" The paralegal's voice didn't waver. "We are not at liberty to discuss the owner's personal details. Sir, all questions must be submitted in writing. We have received your notice of breach. We have seen the video footage of the unapproved structural changes. The eviction process has already been filed with the county." "The county," Liam whispered. He felt the blood drain from his face. They had gone to the county clerk. They were serious. He tried one more time, his voice becoming a desperate, frantic pleading. "Please, you don't understand. I can pay extra. I can pay the new rent. Just give me more time. I will do whatever it takes." "We cannot accept any additional payments," the paralegal said, her voice remaining perfectly clinical. "The property has been scheduled for inspection and subsequent restoration. Your stay will end on the 14th day, regardless of any payment offers. We advise you to seek alternative housing immediately." She hung up the phone. Liam stood in the kitchen, the dead phone pressed against his ear. He was sweating his lungs, struggling to pull in enough air. 3 days until the biggest event of his life, and he was being thrown out on the street. He looked around the house that he thought he was master of, but it suddenly felt like a tomb. He had no money, no insurance, no leverage, and now no home. He had fallen for his own lie, and the trap was finally completely shut. Section 13. 1,000 words. The engagement party was a masterclass in performative excess. The backyard of the house I once called home was transformed into a glittering display of forced wealth. Dozens of string lights were woven through the trees, casting a golden glow over the tables draped in expensive white linen. Hired caterers moved through the crowd with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres, while a live jazz quartet played soft, sophisticated melodies near the pool. Every single person in attendance was someone who had blocked me. Every single person was a friend who had enthusiastically piled on the insults. When Naomi sent that smear campaign into the group chat, I watched from the shadows of the driveway, observing the spectacle. The atmosphere was light, filled with the sound of hollow laughter and clinking glasses. Naomi was in her element, floating between groups of friends, showing off her new ring, and basking in the adoration of a crowd that valued her ability to spend money over her ability to tell the truth. She looked radiant, or at least she was trying very hard to convince everyone that she was. Liam was a different story, even from a distance. I could see the cracks in his performance. He wasn't the boisterous host he usually played at our social gatherings. He held his champagne flute with a white-knuckled grip, his eyes darting toward his phone every few seconds. He was constantly scanning the perimeter, his movements stiff and jerky. He was a man drowning in a sea of his own making, terrified that someone would notice he hadn't paid the catering deposit, or that the luxury liquor company had put him on a final notice for non-payment. Every time Naomi laughed or pulled him into a photo, Liam's smile looked like it was being held in place by invisible wires. He was sweating despite the mild evening air, his tuxedo collar clearly too tight for his mounting anxiety. He was playing the big shot, but he was holding a hand of nothing. He had embezzled from his company, defrauded a bank, and lied to everyone in this yard, all to maintain this one night of manufactured glory. I stood beside the black SUV, taking a slow, steady breath. Ethan stood to my left, his presence a silent, immovable mountain of support. He had traded his usual casual attire for a sharp-tailored suit that signaled he was here for business, not for a social call. Jasmine stood on my right, looking lethal in a floor-length gown that somehow made her look even more like the corporate shark she was. She held her briefcase like a weapon. She had spent the last hour coordinating with the process server who was waiting just around the corner. We weren't here to argue. We weren't here to plead. We were here to finalize the eviction of these thieves from my reality. It was time to pull the curtain back on their pathetic show. I adjusted the straps of my gown, a piece of high-fashion design I had bought specifically for this evening. It was elegant, powerful, and utterly beyond anything Naomi could have ever hoped to afford. I checked my reflection in the car window one last time. I didn't see the woman who had cried in a motel room. I saw a CEO, a landlord, and a predator who had finally tracked her prey. "Let's go," I said to them. My voice was calm, devoid of all tremor. Ethan reached out and gave my arm a firm, grounding squeeze. Jasmine nodded, her eyes fixed on the house with the focus of a tactical strike team. We walked toward the front entrance. The path was lined with candles that flickered in the evening breeze. The sound of the jazz music drifted toward us, mingling with the chatter of the guests. We approached the heavy double doors of the house I still owned. I placed my hand on the polished wood and pushed. The doors swung open with a dramatic heavy creak that somehow sliced through the noise of the party. The interior light poured out into the night. We stepped into the foyer, transitioning from the dark driveway into the golden, manicured luxury of the event. The impact was instantaneous. It started with a single guest near the entrance who stopped talking and stared. Then another, then another. The sound of the jazz quartet continued for 2 bars before the drummer realized the room had gone dead silent. He tapped his cymbal once nervously before trailing off into complete silence. Naomi was standing near the center of the room midway through a toast, a crystal glass raised high in her hand. Her mouth was open, ready to deliver a punchline about how love conquers all. She froze. The glass tipped slightly in her hand, spilling a splash of champagne onto the white rug. She turned her eyes, finding me, and the color drained from her face so completely that her rouge stood out like bruises against her skin. "Liam!" who had been laughing at something a friend whispered in his ear, stopped mid-chuckle. His glass dropped from his hand, shattering on the hardwood floor with a sharp, violent crack that seemed to echo for a mile. He turned, and the absolute horror on his face was a portrait of pure defeat. He didn't just see his ex-wife. He saw the person who held the deed to the house, the authority over his bank accounts, and the witness to his federal crimes. I took another step into the room, my heels clicking sharply against the floorboards. Ethan and Jasmine followed their presence, flanking me like a wall of absolute authority. The crowd of 50 or 60 people, all of whom had sent me cruel messages and blocked my number, now stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. They had been told I was a toxic, broken woman who had disappeared in a fit of instability. Instead, they saw a woman who radiated total control. The silence grew heavy and suffocating. Naomi's hand shook as she slowly lowered her champagne glass. Liam didn't move. He couldn't. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost, only to realize the ghost was the landlord he was about to lose everything to. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The scene was perfectly set. The party was over and the reckoning had just walked through the front door. Naomi snapped out of her paralysis. First, her survival instinct overriding the shock. She marched toward me, her heels digging into the rug, face contorted with a mixture of rage and performative indignation. She pointed a trembling finger at the door and shrieked for me to leave, claiming I was violating her private engagement party. She threatened to call the police, her voice reaching a shrill pitch that set the guests on edge. Everyone watched, hungry for the drama, but increasingly uncomfortable with the scene she was making. I didn't flinch. I reached out, took a full crystal flute of champagne from a passing server, and took a slow, deliberate sip. I offered her a smile that was not warm. It was sharp, surgical, and utterly dismissive. Jasmine stepped into the space between us. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her presence alone had a gravity that forced Naomi to stumble back. Jasmine reached into her leather briefcase and withdrew a thick, crisp document bound in an official blue cover. It was the original deed, authenticated and freshly updated with the current property registration. With a calm practice motion, Jasmine dropped the document onto the white linen table where the cake sat, right in front of where Liam stood, trembling. "You cannot trespass in a house you own," Jasmine said, her tone as cold as an executioner's. The entire room went quiet again. Liam's gaze flickered from the deed to my face and back again. He moved forward, his hand hovering over the paper as if it were a coiled snake. He scanned the document, his eyes widening as he recognized the seal and the clear, unambiguous wording. He saw the name listed as the sole proprietor, Alyssa. He realized that for 5 long years, he had been sending his monthly rent payments directly into an account I controlled. Every time he mocked me for being a broke bookkeeper, he was actually paying me for the privilege of living under my roof. He was my tenant. He had been playing the role of the provider in a house that belonged to the woman he had just humiliated. The realization shattered him. I watched the color drain from his face until he was ghost white. He stumbled back, colliding with a server, sending a tray of appetizers clattering to the floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. Liam looked at me, his mouth working silently, unable to articulate the betrayal of his own ego. He had spent years bragging to his business associates about the deal he got on this place, about how he was the king of his castle, and now he stood revealed as a dependent. Naomi had stopped screaming. She looked down at the deed, then at Liam, the confusion in her eyes turning into pure panic. She realized the money for the renovations, the expensive decor, and the deposit for this party were all built on the foundation of a man who didn't even own the walls he lived within. She had hitched her wagon to a man who was effectively my employee. I took another sip of my champagne, savoring the taste of absolute clarity. It is a lovely home, isn't it? Liam, I asked, my voice cutting through the silence like a razor. I always did have excellent taste in real estate, even if my husband lacked the basic intelligence to check the tax records. Liam finally found his voice, but it was a pathetic, strangled sound. You lied to me, he whispered as if he were the one betrayed. You let me believe I was in charge. You were in charge of the bills, Liam. I corrected, my smile widening. And you did a fantastic job of paying them on time. Thank you for that. I really appreciate the consistent cash flow. It helped me keep my firm running smoothly while you were busy trying to play the part of a big shot. A ripple of nervous laughter broke out among our mutual friends. It was a cruel, uncomfortable sound, but it was directed squarely at Liam. The tables had turned completely, the power dynamic, which had been skewed by his artificial confidence, had snapped back into its rightful place. I wasn't the broke, desperate wife anymore. I was the person who held the power. Naomi tried one last time to reclaim her fading relevance. This doesn't change anything. We have a lease. We have rights. She grabbed the edge of the table, her knuckles white. Jasmine didn't even look at her. She just reached into her briefcase again and produced a second document, the notice of lease termination. She placed it squarely on top of the deed. You had a lease, Jasmine said. The unapproved structural renovations mentioned in your social media posts constitute a material breach of that contract. You have 14 days to vacate. After that, we begin formal eviction proceedings. Naomi's phone, which she had been using to record the night, slipped from her hand and hit the floor, the screen cracking instantly. It was a perfect metaphor for the evening. Her performance was done. The audience was no longer cheering for her. They were watching the ship sink, and they were already looking for the exits. The guests began to murmur, turning to each other to whisper. The secret was out, and the power I held was undeniable. I stood there surrounded by the people who had judged me, the man who had cheated on me, and the woman who had helped him. And I felt nothing but a cool, refreshing sense of control. This was only the beginning. Liam's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated denial. He let out a loud, mocking laugh that sounded more like a bark of distress than actual humor. He turned to the crowd of onlookers, his eyes searching for an ally, any friendly face that would laugh along and validate his failing reality. He pointed a shaking finger at me, his voice booming with forced confidence. You think you are pulling some elaborate scam here, don't you? Alyssa, you are a broke, pathetic accountant who couldn't keep her own marriage afloat. And now you're trying to stage this pathetic theater to win back some dignity. You don't have a corporate trust. You have a pile of student loans and a dream you'll never achieve. He paced in a tight circle, trying to whip the crowd into a frenzy of skepticism. The guests were silent. The air in the room was electric heavy with the weight of the reveal. Liam was desperate to turn me back into the villain, to paint me as the unstable wife who had concocted a complex revenge scheme out of bitterness. He wanted them to believe that the woman standing before them was a fraud. I didn't lose my cool. I didn't raise my voice. I simply opened the second folder Jasmine had brought. I pulled out my authenticated corporate tax returns from the last 3 years, stamped and signed by the IRS and my firm's chief financial officer. I stepped forward and laid the thick, heavy stacks of paper directly onto the white tablecloth right in front of the centerpieces Naomi had picked out. The sheer volume of the documentation was intimidating. Every page was dense with revenue reports, profit margins, and tax liability statements that proved exactly who I was. Liam glanced down, his eyes widening as he read the numbers. His entire body went rigid. I began to speak, my voice cool and professional, the tone I used when briefing a board of directors. For the past 5 years, I haven't been working as a bookkeeper. I have been running a Heil cybersecurity and forensic accounting firm. I clear $800,000 in personal profit annually. And you? Liam, with your mid-level logistics salary, you didn't pay for the lifestyle we enjoyed. You didn't buy the custom furniture, the luxury cars, or the frequent European vacations. I subsidized every single luxury you currently think makes you a successful man. I watched him read the figures. The color left his cheeks entirely. He looked down at the paper as if it were a bomb. I detailed the accounts. I explained how the wire transfers he sent for rent went into my LLC. I pointed out that the premium health insurance he bragged about was purchased through my firm's group policy at a fraction of the cost, which I then billed back to him at a premium to keep the cover story alive. Every item he had bragged about: the vacation upgrades, the expensive dinners, the status he used to build his ego, was a direct result of my labor. He wasn't the provider. He was the freeloader. The realization hit the room like a physical shockwave. The people who had been whispering about my instability were now staring at Liam with expressions of pure disdain. He had been performing a role for years. A role paid for by the woman he had cheated on and discarded. He wasn't a powerful executive in charge of a household. He was a guest in my life who had overstayed his welcome. Naomi tried to move closer to read the documents, her face pale. She saw her own name on some of the financial reports tied to the fraudulent loan documents I had also included in the packet. She realized then that my firm had been tracking their activity for months. I didn't just know their business. I had been watching them fail from the very start. Liam opened his mouth to say something, but no sound came out. He couldn't speak. He couldn't defend himself. He looked at the faces of his friends, his peers, his golf buddies, the people he had tried to impress for years, and saw only contempt. They weren't looking at him with envy anymore. They were looking at him like a pathetic parasite. I continued, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. You called me a broke accountant to Naomi, didn't you? You told her I was the one holding you back. But all this time, I was the one holding you up. You lived in my house. You drove my car. You wore clothes. I bought you. And you ate food I paid for. I didn't just tolerate your lifestyle. Liam, I financed your arrogance. The silence was total. You wanted a clean slate. You wanted to get rid of the broke bookkeeper. You succeeded, but you didn't get rid of a burden. You threw away the very person who made your successful life possible. And now you are sitting in a house you don't own, with a business you didn't build, and a reputation you just destroyed with your own greed. Liam slumped into one of the velvet dining chairs, his face buried in his hands. He couldn't handle the truth. He couldn't handle the fact that his entire self-image was a lie. He was revealed as a fraud, a man with no substance, a freeloader who had thrived only because I allowed him to. I looked at the gathered crowd, many of whom were now looking at their watches, clearly wanting to disappear. This party, this upgraded lifestyle was built on sand, and I was the one who had finally turned on the tide. They stood in the beautiful gilded cage of my own making, trapped by their own greed and stupidity. I turned to Jasmine, who nodded toward the table. The legal and financial massacre was complete. Liam was exposed, and I was finally truly moving on to a life where I was the only one in charge of my destiny. I didn't wait for them to recover. I walked away, leaving them to live in the ruin they had invited into their own house. Section 161,000 words. Naomi stumbled forward, her face twisted into a mask of frantic, desperate defiance. She wouldn't let the scene end here. Her entire social standing depended on preserving the image of the power couple she had constructed. She grabbed Liam's arm, her grip tight enough to leave bruises, and turned to address the room with a shrill, forced laugh. Everyone, please stop listening to her. She is having a nervous breakdown, and she is clearly obsessed with trying to ruin our happiness. Liam is a successful executive at a top-tier firm. He brings in a 6F figure salary. He provides for everything. This folder of hers is nothing but a collection of lies. Probably printed off some random website to create drama because she can't stand seeing us thrive. I didn't lose my composure for a second. I reached out and tapped the play button on my portable speaker sitting on the table. The room filled with the clear, unmistakable sound of Naomi's own voice. It was the recording from the office, the one where she laughed about my supposed failure and plotted to claim my inheritance. Yes, the lawyer says we can claim her portion was forfeited. Her voice chirped through the speakers, sounding even more callous and calculating in the quiet room than it had in the recording. She chose to throw her life away. That money is better off with someone who actually did something with their life. Naomi's face turned from pale to an alarming shade of gray. She tried to reach for the speaker, but Ethan stepped forward, his massive frame blocking her path. The sound continued, followed by my mother's voice agreeing with the scheme. The guests were no longer just watching. They were shrinking away, their expressions shifting from polite curiosity to genuine disgust. I didn't stop there. I reached into the folder one final time and pulled out the federal loan documents. I laid them flat on the table, specifically highlighting the signature section where my name was forged. "This isn't just about inheritance," I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Naomi, this business you are currently running, the one you are so proud of, the one you believe makes you a successful entrepreneur. It was funded with an $80,000 business loan you took out in my name." I watched as the realization dawned on her. She looked at the signature, then back at me, her eyes darting around the room, searching for an exit. "You didn't just steal my husband, Naomi. You stole my credit. You committed identity theft to fund a failing PR firm because you knew you couldn't build anything of value on your own." Liam tried to mutter something about how it was just a temporary arrangement to get the business off the ground, but his voice was drowned out by the audible gasps of our friends. The betrayal wasn't just personal anymore. It was criminal. They had been leading a double life, acting like pillars of the community while operating as low-level common criminals. Naomi's composure disintegrated completely. The shock of being publicly unmasked, coupled with the realization that the life she thought she had stolen was effectively a prison sentence, finally broke her. She looked at Liam, who was standing there looking smaller than I had ever seen him. And the shift was sudden and violent. All the years of competition, all the late-night scheming, all the effort she had put into stealing him away. It had led to this. She turned on him with a feral intensity. She swung her hand and the slap was loud. A sharp, ringing crack that silenced the quartet in the corner and everyone else in the room. Liam reeled back, clutching his cheek, his eyes wide with shock. Naomi didn't stop there. She began screaming at him, accusing him of dragging her into his pathetic mess of lying to her about his financial stability and of being a spineless, thieving coward. The mutual friends, the ones who had mocked me in the group chat, began to back away as if the toxicity of the situation were contagious. They pushed toward the exit, their faces flushed with the realization that they had championed a pair of fraudsters. They wanted no part of this fallout. The elite high society crowd was disappearing as quickly as they had arrived, leaving behind a wake of half-empty wine glasses and shattered reputations. Liam stood in the center of the room, cradling his cheek, looking completely abandoned. He looked at Naomi, who was now sobbing in the corner, and then he looked at me. There was no defiance left in him. He was a man who had built his life on the back of my success and was now standing in the rubble of his own deceit. I felt no pity. I felt no desire to kick him while he was down. I simply felt the finality of the moment. They had cheated, they had stolen, and they had conspired to destroy me. Now they had done a much better job of destroying each other. I looked at the table at the deed, the tax returns, and the forged loan papers, all of which now served as the blueprints for their complete erasure from my life. The party that was supposed to be their coronation had become the scene of their final defeat. As the last of the guests vanished into the night, leaving behind only the cold wind and the empty, expensive centerpieces. I turned to Ethan and Jasmine. It was done. The reveal had been absolute. The betrayal had been mirrored back to them in the most public way possible. They had wanted a life of upgrades, and instead they had successfully upgraded themselves into a legal and social black hole from which they would never recover. I walked toward the front door, ready to leave the house that was mine, leaving them to deal with the wreckage they had invited into their own world. The flashing red and blue lights sliced through the darkness of the evening, turning the manicured lawn into a chaotic strobe of color. Naomi, her eyes, still red and swollen from her earlier meltdown, let out a sharp, hysterical laugh. She turned toward the front door, shouting toward the police officers who were now marching up the gravel path. "You're too late!" she yelled, her voice breaking. "We're already leaving. You don't need to do this over a simple property dispute." She honestly believed the authorities had been called to settle the eviction notice or the drama that had unfolded inside the foyer. She expected a civil conversation, a stern warning, or perhaps an attempt at mediation to keep the peace. She had no idea that the world she was trying to save had already finished burning. The front door swung open with a resounding thud. 3 officers entered their uniforms, stark against the elegance of the party setting. They didn't look at the spilled champagne or the broken glass littering the floor. They weren't there for a noise complaint or a landlord-tenant dispute. The lead officer stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room until they locked onto Liam. He held a document in his hand, a heavy official warrant signed by a federal magistrate. Liam, who had been sitting in the dining chair as if paralyzed, saw the movement and let out a small, sharp sound of denial. He stood up slowly, his legs shaky. He tried to project an air of calm, but his hands were trembling uncontrollably. "Officer, there must be some sort of mistake here." He began, his voice dripping with forced confidence. "We were just settling a civil matter. I'm a director at a major logistics firm. I'm sure my board can clear up whatever this is." The officer didn't offer a reply. He simply held up the warrant. "Liam, you are being placed under arrest for suspicion of corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and falsification of financial records. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The room, which had been buzzing with the sound of departing guests and frantic whispering, fell into a vacuum of silence. Naomi froze her hand halfway to her mouth. She stared at the officers as if they were speaking a language she couldn't understand. "Embezzlement," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Liam, what are they talking about?" I watched from the side of the room, my arms crossed, a feeling of cold, precise justice washing over me. Jasmine stepped forward from the shadows. She pulled out a copy of the forensic audit she had finalized just hours ago. She held the thick stack of papers out to the lead officer. "This audit details the $30,000 misappropriated from the vendor accounts," she said clearly. "Every transaction is mapped, time-stamped, and verified against the company's internal ledger. The ring on your finger, Naomi, was bought with funds stolen from the company's operating budget." Naomi looked down at her hand, her eyes widening as if the diamond ring had suddenly turned into burning coal. She tried to pull it off her finger, her breathing coming in sharp, shallow gasps. Liam didn't look at her. He didn't look at me. He just looked at the silver cuffs in the officer's hands, his face completely devoid of color. The reality of his situation had finally pierced his armor of arrogance. He had stolen from his firm. He had forged documents, and he had done it all while believing he was the smartest person in the room. The officers didn't waste another second. They moved with practiced efficiency, closing the distance between them and Liam. The sound of the metal cuffs clicking shut was loud, a sharp final noise that signaled the end of his fantasy. I watched his hands go behind his back, his body sagging under the weight of his own crimes. He was escorted toward the door, his expensive tuxedo, now a mockery of the man inside it. He was a corporate thief being marched out in front of the very people he had spent the last 2 years trying to impress. Naomi was left standing in the center of the foyer, her world collapsing around her. She looked at me, a desperate, pathetic look. But I didn't offer her a single word of comfort. She was the one who had helped him, the one who had encouraged the fraud, the one who had tried to build her own success on my identity and my property. The police officers didn't arrest her that night. She would have her own day in court later once the paperwork on the identity theft was fully processed. But the message was clear. She was no longer untouchable. She was a co-conspirator. I looked at the remaining guests, the people who had claimed I was unstable and toxic. They were scrambling to get out of the house, trying to scrub their association with the embezzler from their own social reputations. They were leaving behind gifts, half-eaten appetizers, and the cold, lingering stench of failure. I turned back to Ethan and Jasmine. We had achieved exactly what we set out to do. The financial audit had triggered a chain reaction that was too fast for Liam to counter. The board of directors hadn't just fired him. They had gone straight to the federal authorities. They didn't want the scandal to fester. They wanted it gone. And they wanted Liam made an example of. He had embezzled the money for the ring, and now he was going to pay the price in a federal cell. As the police vehicle pulled away, its lights fading into the distance, I stepped out onto the lawn. The air felt cleaner, purged of the dishonesty that had cluttered it for so long. I looked back at the house at the empty foyer where I had lived for years. It was just a building now, stripped of the lies. I was ready for the next step, ready to finalize the dissolution of every link he had to my life. The massacre of his reputation was just the beginning. I had my fortune, I had my truth, and more importantly, I had my life back. The sirens were fading, but the message they left behind would linger for a long time. With Liam's arrest confirmed, and his path toward federal prison clearly paved, my focus shifted entirely to the woman still shivering on my foyer floor. Naomi was no longer the poised PR director who had orchestrated my social exile. She was a woman facing the total annihilation of her future. The remaining guests in the room were frozen, their faces pale as they realized the gravity of the legal documents scattered across the table. They weren't just guests at a party anymore. They were witnesses to a criminal investigation. And the air of self-importance that had filled the room only moments ago had curdled into palpable fear. Jasmine didn't waste a heartbeat. She took a step toward Naomi, who was still clutching her ruined phone, her breath coming in shallow. Ragged gasps. Jasmine pulled a fresh, thick set of documents from her second briefcase. This wasn't a friendly conversation. It was a formal service of process. She held the papers out. But Naomi didn't take them. Jasmine simply dropped them onto the champagne-soaked rug at Naomi's feet. "This is a comprehensive lawsuit filed by our firm, Jasmine," said her voice, cutting through the silence of the now deserted party. "It covers your direct complicity in identity theft, your active participation in wire fraud, and the documented evidence of your role in the embezzlement scheme. We have the digital logs showing exactly how you move the stolen funds through your business accounts." Naomi stared down at the documents as if they were venomous. She looked up at me, her eyes begging for mercy for a moment of shared history, or for some acknowledgement that I would be the bigger person. I gave her none of that. She had chosen to steal my husband and my financial security. And in doing so, she had forfeited any right to my compassion. "You have 24 hours to clear out of this property," I said, my voice cold and firm. I looked at my watch and then back at her. "This house is my private residence, and I am officially terminating your stay. You have exactly 1 full day to pack your cheap bags, remove every single item you brought into my home, and disappear from my life. If you aren't out by this time tomorrow, I will have the sheriff remove you for trespassing, and I will add a separate criminal complaint for every hour you occupy this space. The mutual friends, the people who had spent the last hour fawning over the upgrades in the ring, were now in a frantic race for the exit. They scrambled toward the front door, avoiding my gaze, tripping over their own feet in their desperation to distance themselves from the wreckage. They didn't even say goodbye to Naomi. They didn't offer a helping hand. They knew that being associated with a pair of felons was social and professional suicide. Within moments, the luxury foyer was empty of everyone except Naomi, me, Ethan, and Jasmine. Naomi's knees finally gave out and she sank onto the expensive rug. The same rug she had filmed for her social media flex only that morning. She started to sob, a sound that was ugly and unrefined. She tried to tell me that she was just a victim of Liam's lies, that she had no idea the business loans were fraudulent, and that she was truly sorry for the affair. Her apologies were an insult. She had been the one to organize the smear campaign. She had been the one to post the videos mocking my perceived failures. She had spent weeks savoring the thought of my ruin. I looked at her and felt absolutely nothing. The anger had burned itself out, leaving only a clinical sense of finality. "Save the tears for your lawyer, Naomi," I said, turning away from her. "You are going to need every ounce of energy you have to survive what Jasmine is about to unleash on you. You thought I was a broke bookkeeper you could walk over. You thought my life was an empty shell you could occupy. But all you managed to do was occupy a crime scene of your own construction." Ethan stepped forward and opened the front door, letting the cool night air flood into the house. The sight of the open door framing the dark path where my life had been turned upside down served as a silent order. "Get out of my house," I said to her one last time. "Pack your things. Don't touch anything that belongs to me. If I find even a single scratch on the furniture that isn't already there, I will add it to the damage claim in your lawsuit." Naomi didn't fight back. She couldn't. The weight of her situation, the bankruptcy, the impending criminal charges, the loss of her career, and the public humiliation had finally crushed the last of her ego. She crawled to her feet, her mascara running in dark streaks down her cheeks, and began to stagger toward the stairs. She was no longer a PR executive. She was just a thief, and she was doing exactly what I had demanded. I looked at Ethan, who gave a single satisfied nod. Jasmine just began organizing her briefcase, already preparing for the next step of the litigation. I walked back toward the kitchen, my heels echoing in the cavernous house that was now finally silent. I had taken back my home. I had dismantled the life they had stolen from me, and I had done it all while they were busy playing at success. The house felt like it was finally mine again, stripped of the influence of the people who didn't belong here. I sat down at the kitchen island, the same spot where Liam used to sit, and lecture me about responsibility. I felt a sense of clarity that was absolutely absolute. I was no longer the wife, the bookkeeper, or the victim. I was the person who was in control. The party was gone. The mistress was packing her cheap belongings, and the husband was in a holding cell. I had finally won. Section 19,100 words. 3 days of radio silence passed before the walls of Naomi's world began to close in for good. I was reviewing the quarterly projections for my firm when my executive assistant signaled over the intercom that a woman named Naomi was in the lobby demanding to see me. She wasn't an appointment. She was a desperate intruder. I told my assistant to let her up, curious to see just how much of her arrogance remained after a week of dealing with the absolute ruin I had orchestrated. Naomi didn't look like the PR director who had hosted a party in my foyer. She looked like a woman who had been awake for 72 hours. Her clothes were wrinkled, her hair lacked its usual expensive sheen, and she had clearly skipped the salon appointments that were once her top priority. She burst into my office, her eyes puffy and red, and tried to fall to her knees in front of my desk. I remained seated, hands folded on my desk, looking at her as if she were a particularly bothersome insect that had wandered into my sanctuary. "Please, Alyssa," You have to listen to me, she wailed, her voice cracking in a way that made me feel nothing but a cold, clinical curiosity. I have nothing left. My firm is gone. My reputation is destroyed. And the bank is coming after every asset I have. I'm going to declare bankruptcy. I can't survive this. You're the only one who can stop it. If you just drop the civil suits and retract the fraud reports, I can start over. Please, I'll do anything. I didn't blink. I didn't reach out to offer her a tissue. I simply watched her, waiting for her to finish. When she finally fell silent, the room felt incredibly small and oppressive. You're asking me to trade my integrity for your convenience. I said, my voice as level as a spirit level. You didn't just stumble into a bad situation. Naomi, you spent years meticulously planning to dismantle my life. You lied to our friends. You forged my identity. And you thrived while you thought I was drowning. The bankruptcy isn't a tragedy. It's a consequence. It is the logical end of the path you chose. Naomi's face hardened for a split second, a flash of her old manipulative self, surfacing before the panic drowned out again. But we were friends. We shared everything. We weren't friends. I corrected her. Friends don't sleep with each other's husbands. Friends don't build businesses on stolen identities. You weren't my friend. You were a parasite that I finally had the sense to detach. I hit the intercom button. Security, please escort this woman out of my office. She has reached the limit of her time. Before she could scream, 2 of my security team members, both giants in tactical gear, stepped into the room. Naomi looked at them, then back at me, her expression shifting to one of genuine raw terror. She realized I wasn't playing. She realized that the broke bookkeeper I once pretended to be was completely gone, replaced by a woman who would not be moved by tears or nostalgia. They grabbed her by the arms and hauled her toward the hallway. As she was dragged out, her desperate shrieks about how she would never forgive me echoed off the glass walls. I didn't care. I turned back to my monitor, the sound of her exit providing a satisfying rhythm to my morning. Just as the door clicked shut, my phone began to buzz with a restricted caller ID. I knew exactly who it was. Liam had been calling me from the county jail every day since his arrest. His calls always routed through the same automated system. I answered and hit the speakerphone button, letting the sound fill the room. Alyssa. Thank God Liam's voice was strained, vibrating with a mix of frustration and the pathetic, manipulative charm that had once held me captive. I'm in a hellhole in here. You have to help me with the bail. I know you're angry and you have every right to be. But think about the 10 years we had together. We had 10 good years. Alyssa. 10 years of love, of building a future. You can't just throw all of that away because of one mistake. I leaned back in my chair, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. One mistake. You embezzled from your employer. You stole my identity. You committed federal wire fraud. That isn't a mistake, Liam. That is a career choice. He groaned, the sound of metal bars clanging in the background. Stop being so cold. I did it because I was under pressure to provide for us. I wanted to give you the best life possible. I did it for us. You didn't do it for us, I said. My voice, cutting through his lies like a diamond on glass. You did it to impress Naomi. You did it because your ego needed to be fed. And you were willing to sacrifice my financial future and my reputation to keep your image inflated. The 10 years we spent together. Those were years I spent being the silent, invisible force behind your fake success. He went silent for a moment, the weight of the rejection finally hitting him. Please, Alyssa, just pay the bail. I have a plan. I can get my old job back. I can make this right. We can start over. I thought back to the conversation I had with Jasmine earlier that morning. We had discussed the plea deal the prosecutors were offering. There was no starting over. There was only the prison term he had earned. Liam. I filed for divorce to clear the path for you and Naomi, I said, my voice absolutely frigid. You were so eager to have her, so eager to build a life with her that you forged my signature to do it. The path you cleared leads straight to a federal prison. I suggest you enjoy the walk. I didn't wait for him to scream. I didn't wait for him to invoke our past or appeal to my conscience. I pressed the end call button, the silence that returned to the office feeling like the freshest air I had ever breathed. The smear campaign, the fraud, the gaslighting, it was all gone, erased by the simple act of holding them accountable. They had spent their lives playing at being better than everyone else, and now they were exactly where they belonged. I was finally irrevocably free. The federal courthouse in downtown Portland felt colder than I remembered a sterile monument to consequence. I sat in the back row of the gallery, watching Liam stand before the bench. Gone was the arrogant executive in the custom-tailored suit. He wore the drab, ill-fitting uniform of a federal inmate, his hair thinning, and his shoulders hunched in a permanent posture of defeat. The judge didn't mince words. She cited the systematic nature of the embezzlement, the clear intent behind the identity theft, and the violation of professional trust. Liam was sentenced to 3 years in a federal penitentiary. When he turned to look at the gallery, our eyes met for one brief, hollow second. He looked like he wanted to say something, perhaps an apology or a plea for mercy, but the baifs were already guiding him away. There was no closure in his expression, just a terrifying realization that his old life was permanently dead. Naomi's downfall was not marked by a gavel, but by a series of quiet, devastating paper trails. Her PR firm, already hollowed out by her mismanagement, and the bank's freeze on her fraudulent capital, folded within weeks. She filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, her name dragged through the mud in local business journals. The last I heard. She had moved back into her childhood bedroom in a small industrial town 4 states away, living under the constant scrutiny of parents who were deeply embarrassed by the viral videos of her meltdown. She had tried to leverage her influence to land new clients, but the digital footprint of her fraud made her unhireable in any industry that valued ethical standards. She had wanted to be a power player in the city. Instead, she became a cautionary tale in a town that didn't know her name, a few days after Liam's sentencing. My phone began to buzz with notifications. It was the Thursday night crew. Apparently. The news of Liam's sentencing and Naomi's bankruptcy had prompted a sudden wave of moral clarity among my former friends. The messages were pathetic, repetitive strings of text. They claimed they had been duped by Naomi's manipulative storytelling. They said they were sorry for cutting me off, that they hadn't known the full truth, and that they missed the board game nights we used to share. They offered invitations to coffee, to drinks, and to dinners, all wrapped in the thin, flimsy paper of their convenience. I didn't feel a single flicker of anger, nor did I feel the slightest urge to explain myself. I didn't owe these people the labor of my forgiveness. They had chosen to align themselves with a pair of criminals because it made them feel superior to exclude me. I selected the group chat, pressed the options menu, and hit block. One by one, I went through their individual profiles. Block, delete. The silence that followed was absolute. Protecting my peace wasn't about being mean. It was about curating an environment where honesty was the minimum entry requirement. With the legal loose ends tied, I moved to the final step of my physical cleansing. I hired a real estate agency to list the Victorian house in Beacon Hill. It took less than a month to sell. When the final closing papers were signed and the funds were wired, I didn't keep a single cent of the profit. I contacted a reputable national charity dedicated to helping victims of financial abuse and corporate fraud. I donated every dollar of the house sale to their legal defense and emergency support programs. It felt right to take the structure Liam had once called his own and turn it into a source of stability for people who had actually been crushed by the kinds of people he was. Now, 6 months after that final gavel fell, I stand on the balcony of a penthouse overlooking the Manhattan skyline. The air here is sharp and smells of ambition. It is a far cry from the claustrophobic feeling of my old suburban home. Behind me, the sound of jazz music drifts from my living room, but this time it is played by friends I have chosen, people who value integrity, who don't need to be lied to, and who celebrate my success as their own. Jasmine steps out onto the balcony holding 2 crystal flutes. Ethan follows, laughing at something she just said. She hands me a drink, the glass cold and heavy in my hand. We clink our glasses together, the sound sharp and clear against the city noise. I look out at the grid of lights stretching to the horizon, the city that never stops moving, and I think about the last 4 years. I was once a woman who felt she had to shrink her own existence to fit into a cage someone else had built. I allowed myself to be cast as a disappointment and a failure because I didn't want to threaten the fragile ego of a man who was, in truth, a shell of a person. I learned that the most dangerous thing you can do is accept a false definition of your own value. Building a chosen family, a group of people who are grounded, successful, and deeply honest, has been the greatest project of my life. I didn't become a victim because I chose to refuse the role. I didn't win because I was lucky. I won because I was meticulous, patient, and prepared to use every legal and financial tool at my disposal. Karma is a powerful force, but it works best when you give it a little nudge with a very expensive, very ruthless lawyer. I have everything I ever worked for, not because Liam gave it to me, but because I never stopped building it, even when he thought I was doing nothing. My life is mine again, completely and entirely. Have you ever had to hide your success to protect a fragile ego? Share your story in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of survival and justice. See you next time. The most profound lesson from the journey of the protagonist is that our true worth is never defined by how others perceive us, nor is it dependent on their approval. For years, the protagonist allowed her identity to be shaped by a partner who sought to keep her small to bolster his own fragile ego. This is a common trap. We often shrink our successes and silence our ambitions to maintain a false harmony with people who thrive on our perceived vulnerability. However, the story demonstrates that real power lies in the refusal to play a submissive role in someone else's scripted narrative. By quietly building her own resources, protecting her assets, and maintaining her integrity, she transformed from a perceived victim into the architect of her own justice. The lesson here is that boundaries are not just defensive walls. They are the foundation upon which authentic self-respect is built. When we stop seeking validation from those who have demonstrated they cannot provide it, we reclaim the mental and emotional space required to build a life of genuine meaning. True success is not about accumulating status or power over others, but about the freedom to walk away from toxic dynamics and